Marcus stood at attention outside the grand gates of the royal palace, his weathered hands gripping the ornate spear that had been passed down through 3 generations of palace guards. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard, but its warmth couldn't reach the chill that had settled in his heart over the past few months. His uniform, once pristine and commanding respect, now bore the unmistakable signs of wear and countless repairs. The fabric of his tunic had faded from its original deep burgundy to a dull, tired color that seemed to match his spirits. Small holes had been carefully mended with threads that didn't quite match, creating a patchwork of imperfections that drew unwanted attention from palace visitors and fellow guards alike. Most noticeable was a distinctive patch on his left sleeve, sewn with different colored thread and slightly raised from the surrounding fabric. It was this patch that had become the source of endless mockery and cruel jokes from his colleagues. "Look at old Marcus," whispered Guard Captain Reynolds to his companion as they passed by the main gate, "still wearing that pathetic excuse for a uniform. Does he think this is some village militia?" The words carried on the morning breeze, and Marcus pretended not to hear them, though each syllable cut deep into his pride. Reynolds had been promoted to captain just 2 years ago, a young man with connections and a family fortune that afforded him the finest uniforms money could buy. His tunic was made from the best materials, with golden threads that caught the sunlight and brass buttons that gleamed like mirrors. He took every opportunity to remind the other guards of the standards expected of the royal guard, often using Marcus as an example of what not to be. "The royal family deserves better than to see such disgrace at their gates," Reynolds continued, his voice growing louder with intention. "Perhaps it's time for certain guards to consider retirement, or at least invest in proper attire befitting their station." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his position. He had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only made things worse. At 53 years old, he was one of the oldest active guards in the palace, and his experience should have commanded respect. Instead, it seemed to make him a target for younger guards who saw his worn appearance as a sign of weakness or a lack of dedication. The truth was far more complex than they could imagine. Marcus had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty for over 30 years, starting as a young recruit fresh from his village. He had witnessed 3 coronations, countless state dinners, and diplomatic visits from foreign dignitaries. He knew every stone in the palace walls, every secret passage, and every potential security risk. His knowledge of palace protocol was unmatched, and his dedication to protecting the royal family was absolute. But life had dealt him a series of devastating blows that had drained his resources and left him struggling to maintain even the basic necessities. His wife, Elena, had fallen seriously ill 3 years ago, and the medical treatment had consumed their entire savings. The royal guard salary, while steady, was modest, and the cost of her care had forced Marcus to make difficult choices. Elena had been everything to Marcus. They had met when he was a young guard, and she was working in the palace kitchens. Her smile could light up the darkest corners of the castle, and her gentle nature had won the hearts of everyone who knew her. They had been blessed with 2 children, but tragedy had struck early when both had died in infancy from a fever that swept through the village. The loss had brought them closer together, and Elena had become not just his wife, but his closest friend and greatest support. When Elena fell ill, Marcus had spared no expense in seeking treatment. He had consulted the best physicians in the kingdom, purchased expensive medicines, and even traveled to distant cities where specialists claimed to have cures for her condition. Each failed treatment had cost more money they didn't have, and gradually, Marcus had been forced to sell their modest home, their furniture, and even Elena's precious jewelry that had been her mother's. The final blow had come 6 months ago when Elena passed away peacefully in their small rented room, holding Marcus's hand and whispering words of love and encouragement. She had begged him not to blame himself for their financial struggles, reminding him that he had given her the most precious gift of all, a lifetime of love and devotion. Her last words had been a plea for him to take care of himself and to continue serving with the honor and dignity that had always defined him. Now, Marcus lived alone in a tiny room above a baker's shop, surviving on his guard salary and the occasional odd job he could find during his off-duty hours. Every coin went toward basic necessities, leaving nothing for a new uniform. He had carefully maintained his current one, washing it regularly and mending tears with whatever thread he could afford. The distinctive patch on his sleeve covered a tear that had occurred during a particularly challenging day when he had to help subdue an intruder who had somehow breached the outer defenses. That day had been a testament to Marcus's skill and dedication. The intruder had been armed and dangerous, and while the younger guards had hesitated, Marcus had acted swiftly and decisively. He had sustained a knife wound to his arm during the struggle, but had managed to capture the intruder without allowing him to reach the royal quarters. The patch covered not just a tear in his uniform, but a scar that represented his willingness to shed blood in defense of the royal family. Yet none of his colleagues knew this story. They saw only the visible poverty, the faded fabric, and the mismatched patches. In their minds, these imperfections reflected a lack of pride or commitment. They couldn't understand that for Marcus, wearing this uniform, even in its worn condition, was an honor that no amount of mockery could diminish. As the morning progressed, more guards arrived for their shifts, and the comments about Marcus's appearance became more frequent and cruel. Guard Lieutenant Harrison, a man barely half Marcus's age, made a show of inspecting his own immaculate uniform before approaching Marcus's post. "Marcus, I'm concerned about the image you're projecting," Harrison said with false concern. "Perhaps you should consider taking a leave of absence until you can afford proper attire. We can't have visitors thinking the Royal Guard has fallen on hard times." The irony was not lost on Marcus. The Royal Guard as an institution was incredibly wealthy, with budgets for new uniforms, equipment, and training. But individual guards, especially those without family wealth or secondary income, often struggled to maintain the expected standards on their modest salaries. The palace administration assumed that guards would supplement their income through family support or side businesses, an assumption that didn't account for situations like Marcus's. "My uniform meets regulation requirements," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. He was technically correct. There were no specific rules about the appearance of mended uniforms, only requirements about cleanliness and proper insignia. "Technically, perhaps," Harrison sneered, "but surely you understand that we represent something greater than mere compliance with minimum standards. We embody the dignity and power of the crown itself." These words stung because Marcus understood their truth better than Harrison ever could. He had dedicated his life to embodying the values of service, loyalty, and sacrifice that the Royal Guard represented. But he also knew that dignity could not be measured by the quality of one's fabric or the shine of one's buttons. True dignity came from within, from the choices one made, and the principles one upheld. As Harrison walked away, shaking his head in apparent disgust, Marcus caught sight of his own reflection in the polished surface of the palace gate. The image showed a man who had aged beyond his years, with graying hair and lines etched deep by worry and grief. His uniform, despite its flaws, was clean and properly arranged. His posture remained straight and proud, and his eyes still held the alertness of a dedicated guardian. The distinctive patch on his sleeve caught the light, and for a moment, Marcus remembered the day it had been sewn on. Elena had insisted on doing the repair herself, despite her weakening condition. Her hands had shaken with illness, but she had worked carefully, choosing thread that she thought would be most durable rather than most matching. "This will remind you," she had whispered, "that sometimes the strongest repairs don't try to hide themselves. Sometimes they show the world that something valuable was worth saving." Those words echoed in Marcus's mind as he endured another day of subtle insults and pointed remarks. He thought about Elena's wisdom and her understanding that true strength often came disguised as apparent weakness. She had seen past the surface of things to the deeper truths beneath, a gift that had made her not only a loving wife, but a wise counselor during their years together. The palace gates remained busy throughout the morning as various officials, merchants, and petitioners came and went. Marcus performed his duties with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire career. He checked credentials, maintained security protocols, and kept careful watch for any signs of trouble. His experience had taught him to notice things that younger guards might miss: subtle changes in behavior, unusual patterns in visitor traffic, and potential security vulnerabilities. During a brief lull in activity, Marcus found himself thinking about his early days as a guard. He had been so proud when he first donned a royal uniform, feeling as though he had achieved something truly significant. The fabric had been crisp and new, the colors vivid and commanding. He had stood a little straighter, spoken a little louder, and believed that the uniform somehow made him a better person. Over the years, he had learned that the uniform was merely a symbol. The real work of being a royal guard happened in moments of crisis, in split-second decisions that could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe for the people he had sworn to protect. He had faced those moments numerous times, and each time, his worn uniform had been irrelevant to his effectiveness or his courage. But he also understood the power of appearances and the way that visual impressions could shape perceptions. The mockery he endured wasn't entirely without foundation. First impressions mattered, and his appearance did create questions about the standards and resources of the Royal Guard. He wished desperately that he could afford a new uniform, not for his own vanity, but to eliminate this distraction from his true purpose. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warmer, Marcus noticed a small group of visiting dignitaries approaching the gates. They were dressed in fine clothes and accompanied by their own guards, clearly people of importance who would be paying attention to every detail of their reception at the palace. This was exactly the kind of situation where his appearance might reflect poorly on the entire institution he served. The lead dignitary, an elderly man with an ornate walking stick and elaborate robes, paused as he presented his credentials to Marcus. His eyes took in the worn uniform and the distinctive patch, and Marcus saw the familiar expression of surprise and slight disappointment. It was a look he had grown accustomed to, but it never stopped hurting. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said formally, returning the man's papers after careful inspection. "You and your party are cleared to enter. Please proceed to the main hall, where you will be met by the protocol officer." The dignitary nodded curtly and moved past, but not before exchanging a meaningful look with his companions. Marcus knew they would likely comment on what they had seen, perhaps even mention it to their palace hosts. Word might eventually reach the higher levels of palace administration, adding to the pressure for Marcus to somehow improve his appearance or face more serious consequences. As the morning wore on, Marcus's fellow guards continued their campaign of subtle harassment. They would position themselves where visiting officials could overhear their comments about standards and appearances. They would make pointed jokes about charitable organizations that might help unfortunate guards acquire proper uniforms. Each comment was carefully crafted to sound like concerned professionalism while delivering maximum humiliation. The cruelest moment came when Guard Captain Reynolds announced that he was organizing a collection among the guards to help Marcus maintain the dignity of his position. The announcement was made loudly enough for several palace staff members to hear, creating the impression that Marcus was not only poorly dressed, but also in need of charity from his colleagues. "We all understand that circumstances can sometimes make it difficult to maintain proper standards," Reynolds declared with false compassion. "As brothers in service, we should support each other in upholding the honor of our shared profession." The offer was designed to be impossible to accept or reject gracefully. If Marcus accepted, he would be acknowledging his poverty and accepting handouts from people who had shown him nothing but contempt. If he refused, he would appear prideful and ungrateful, further damaging his reputation among his peers. "I appreciate the thought," Marcus replied carefully, "but my uniform meets all required standards, and I prefer to maintain my own equipment." It was the most diplomatic response he could manage, but he knew it would satisfy no one. Reynolds smiled coldly. "Of course, Marcus. We just want to ensure that everyone feels supported and valued." The words carried an unmistakable threat: comply with our expectations or face increasing pressure. As his shift continued, Marcus found himself reflecting on the nature of honor and dignity. The younger guards seemed to believe that these qualities could be purchased, that appearance was the same as substance. They had never faced the kind of choices that real life sometimes demanded, never had to choose between personal pride and family loyalty, never learned that sometimes the most honorable path was also the most difficult. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another group of visitors, this one including several foreign ambassadors and their retinues. The palace had been busy lately with diplomatic meetings, and Marcus knew that each interaction would be scrutinized for signs of the kingdom's strength and stability. His appearance would once again be part of that assessment, another small detail that might influence important political relationships. As he checked the ambassador's credentials, Marcus noticed that one of them, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, was studying his uniform with particular interest. Unlike the earlier dignitary, her expression wasn't one of disappointment or surprise, but rather of curious attention. She seemed to be looking at his sleeve patch with recognition, though Marcus couldn't imagine why a foreign ambassador would find anything familiar about his mended uniform. The woman passed through the gates without comment, but Marcus caught her glancing back at him as she walked toward the palace entrance. There was something unsettling about her attention, though he couldn't quite identify what bothered him about it. In his experience, when important people took notice of his appearance, it rarely led to positive outcomes. The rest of his morning shift passed without major incident, though the pattern of subtle mockery and pointed comments from his colleagues continued. By the time his relief arrived, Marcus felt emotionally drained despite the relatively routine nature of his duties. He had always taken pride in his ability to compartmentalize personal struggles and focus entirely on his professional responsibilities, but the constant harassment was making that increasingly difficult. As he prepared to leave his post, Marcus took a final look at the palace gates and the courtyard beyond. This place had been his second home for 3 decades, and despite everything, he still felt a deep connection to its ancient stones and time-honored traditions. The palace represented continuity, stability, and the enduring strength of the kingdom he served. Whatever personal challenges he faced, he remained honored to play a small role in preserving those values. Walking home through the busy streets of the capital, Marcus passed shops displaying fine fabrics and tailoring services that might as well have been on another continent for all their relevance to his life. He paused briefly outside one establishment where uniforms similar to his were displayed in the window, their prices clearly marked for wealthy guards or those with family resources. The cost of a single new uniform was more than he earned in 2 months, an impossible expense for someone in his situation. The bakery below his small room was closing as he arrived home, filling the narrow stairway with a warm scent of fresh bread. Mrs. Chun, the baker's wife, greeted him with a kind smile and a small bundle of day-old pastries that she insisted were too old to sell, but which Marcus knew was her gentle way of supplementing his meager diet without making him feel like a charity case. His room was sparse, but clean, containing only the essentials for basic living: a narrow bed, a small table and chair, and a trunk containing his few personal possessions. On the table sat a framed photograph of Elena, taken during happier times when they had believed their love could overcome any challenge. Her smile seemed to radiate warmth even from the frozen moment in time, reminding Marcus of all the joy and hope they had shared. As evening approached, Marcus prepared for another day tomorrow, another opportunity to serve with honor despite the challenges he faced. He carefully cleaned and pressed his uniform, paying special attention to the distinctive patch that had become such a source of torment. Elena's handiwork remained strong and secure, a testament to her skill and the love she had sown into every stitch. Looking at his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin, Marcus saw the same weathered face and tired eyes that had greeted him that morning. But beneath the surface fatigue and worry, he could still recognize the young man who had first sworn an oath to protect and serve the royal family. That oath remained as sacred to him now as it had been 30 years ago, and no amount of mockery or hardship could diminish its importance. Tomorrow would bring another day of service, another opportunity to prove that true honor came from within rather than from the quality of one's clothes. Marcus knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he carried within him the strength and wisdom that Elena had helped him cultivate over their years together. Her love continued to sustain him, just as his commitment to duty provided meaning and purpose to his life. The worn patch on his sleeve was more than just a repair. It was a symbol of resilience, of the ability to continue functioning even after sustaining damage. Like the uniform itself, Marcus had been mended and patched, but he remained strong and capable of fulfilling his duties. The mockery of his colleagues revealed their own shallow understanding of what truly mattered, while his persistence in the face of their cruelty demonstrated the depth of his character. As night fell over the capital city, Marcus prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would test his resolve once again. But he faced the future with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that external circumstances could not diminish internal worth, and that true dignity was earned through service and sacrifice rather than purchased with fine clothes. The following morning brought with it a crisp autumn chill that seemed to mirror the cold reception Marcus had come to expect from his fellow guards. As he made his way through the palace grounds toward his assigned post, he noticed an unusual amount of activity around the main administrative building. Servants hurried past carrying stacks of documents, and several high-ranking officials were engaged in intense conversations near the entrance. Word quickly spread among the guards that something significant was happening. Foreign delegations have been arriving throughout the week, and today promised to bring the culmination of whatever diplomatic negotiations have been taking place behind closed doors. For the Royal Guard, this meant heightened security protocols and increased scrutiny of their performance and appearance. Marcus took his position at the Eastern Gate, one of the less prominent entrances typically used by service personnel and lower-ranking visitors. It was an assignment that reflected his diminished status among the guards, though he performed his duties there with the same dedication he had always shown at the main gates. The eastern entrance might have been less prestigious, but it was no less important for maintaining the security of the palace complex. As the morning progressed, the mockery from his colleagues intensified. Word of Captain Reynolds' charitable collection had spread throughout the guard force, and Marcus found himself the subject of increasingly pointed comments and cruel jokes. Guards would walk past his post deliberately, making loud observations about maintaining standards and protecting the reputation of the service. "I heard they're bringing in foreign military observers today," announced Lieutenant Harrison to a group of younger guards within earshot of Marcus's position. "Imagine what they'll think when they see the sorry state of our personnel. They might question whether we're capable of protecting a chicken coop, much less a royal palace." The younger guards laughed appreciatively, clearly enjoying the opportunity to participate in the harassment while currying favor with their superior officers. Marcus had seen this pattern before. Junior personnel often joined in bullying behavior not out of genuine malice, but from a desire to fit in and avoid becoming targets themselves. One of the younger guards, a recruit named Thomas who had joined the service only 6 months ago, seemed particularly uncomfortable with the situation. Marcus had noticed that while Thomas didn't actively participate in the mockery, he also didn't speak up against it. The young man would glance nervously between his laughing colleagues, and Marcus, clearly torn between his desire to belong and his apparent sense that what was happening was wrong. Thomas had been assigned to shadow Marcus during his early training, and in those weeks he had seen firsthand the depth of Marcus's knowledge and dedication. Marcus had patiently taught him the intricacies of security protocols, shared insights gained from decades of experience, and demonstrated the kind of professionalism that made the Royal Guard an elite force. But peer pressure was a powerful force, and Thomas seemed unable to find the courage to defend someone who had once been his mentor. The situation took a darker turn when Captain Reynolds arrived with a formal-looking document in his hand. His expression was serious, and the group of guard around him fell silent as he approached Marcus's post. There was something ominous about his demeanor that suggested this wasn't going to be another round of casual harassment. "Marcus," Reynolds announced loudly enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, "I've received a formal complaint about your appearance from yesterday's diplomatic visitors. The palace administration has asked me to address this matter immediately." Marcus felt his heart sink, though he maintained his composure. He had feared that something like this might happen, and now it seemed his worst expectations were being realized. The complaint could provide Reynolds with the justification he needed to take more serious action against Marcus, possibly including suspension or forced retirement. "What specific concerns were raised, sir?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level and professional. He had learned long ago that the best defense in situations like this was to remain calm and request specific information rather than allowing emotions to dictate his response. Reynolds consulted his document with theatrical precision, clearly savoring the moment. "The complaint states that your uniform presents an unprofessional appearance that reflects poorly on the palace and the kingdom. There are specific mentions of visible patches, faded colors, and an overall impression of neglect." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, not because they were untrue, but because they reduced his 30 years of dedicated service to a superficial assessment of his clothing. He thought about all the crises he had helped manage, all the potential threats he had identified and neutralized, all the quiet moments when his vigilance had helped maintain the peace and security that everyone else took for granted. "I understand the concern about appearances," Marcus replied carefully, "but I want to emphasize that my uniform meets all regulatory requirements for cleanliness and proper insignia. I take great care to maintain it to the best of my ability." Reynolds smiled coldly, clearly anticipating this response. "The issue isn't about meeting minimum requirements, Marcus. It's about upholding the standards of excellence that distinguish the Royal Guard from ordinary security personnel. Our visitors expect to see the finest representatives of our kingdom's military tradition." The irony of the situation was painfully clear to Marcus. The standards of excellence that Reynolds spoke of were largely about wealth and social class rather than actual competence or dedication. A guard from a wealthy family could afford the finest uniforms and equipment, while someone like Marcus, who had sacrificed everything for his family and continued to serve with unwavering loyalty, was deemed inadequate based solely on financial circumstances. "Effective immediately," Reynolds continued, consulting his document again. "You are being transferred to interior duties pending a review of your status. You will report to the quartermaster's office for assignment to inventory and maintenance duties." The announcement sent a ripple of satisfaction through the watching guards, while Marcus felt his world shift beneath him. Interior duties were typically assigned to guards who were being phased out of active service, often as a prelude to forced retirement or dismissal. It was a professional humiliation that would effectively end his career as an active Royal Guard. "Sir," Marcus said, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor, "I would like to request a hearing before any permanent changes are made to my assignment. I believe my service record demonstrates my continued value to the Royal Guard." Reynolds' expression hardened, clearly annoyed that Marcus wasn't simply accepting his fate quietly. "Your service record is noted, but it doesn't change the current reality. The Royal Guard must evolve with the times, and that means maintaining standards that reflect our position as the kingdom's elite force." As the crowd of guards began to disperse, clearly satisfied with the morning's entertainment, Marcus found himself standing alone at his post for what might be the last time. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he had to fight to control the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about Elena and how she would have responded to this situation. She had always possessed an inner strength that allowed her to face adversity with grace and determination. Even during her final illness, she had maintained her dignity and optimism, refusing to let circumstances diminish her spirit. Marcus drew on the memory of her courage, knowing that she would expect him to face this challenge with the same integrity that had defined their life together. The transfer to interior duties began that afternoon, and Marcus found himself in the bowels of the palace, surrounded by stacks of supplies and equipment that needed cataloging and maintenance. It was honest work, but it felt like a form of exile from the active service that had given his life meaning and purpose. The quartermaster, a gruff but fair man named Sergeant Walsh, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "This is a waste of good experience," Walsh muttered as he showed Marcus around the storage areas. "I've got plenty of young recruits who could do this inventory work, but I can't teach them what you know about security and protocol." Walsh had served alongside Marcus during their early years in the Guard, and they had developed a mutual respect based on shared experiences and common values. Unlike many of the current leadership, Walsh understood that competence couldn't be measured by the shine of one's buttons or the newness of one's uniform. "Orders are orders," Marcus replied diplomatically, though he appreciated Walsh's support. "I'll do whatever duties I'm assigned to the best of my ability." The inventory work itself was tedious, but not unpleasant. Marcus found himself cataloging weapons, armor, ceremonial items, and supplies that supported the daily operations of the Royal Guard. It was fascinating to see the breadth of equipment and resources that went into maintaining the palace's security, much of it invisible to the guards who used it daily. As he worked, Marcus began to notice patterns in the inventory that suggested potential problems with supply management and equipment maintenance. Several items were listed as present, but couldn't be located, while others showed signs of wear or damage that hadn't been properly documented. His experience had taught him to pay attention to such details, recognizing that small oversights could sometimes lead to larger security vulnerabilities. But even as he threw himself into this new work, Marcus couldn't escape the feeling that he was being deliberately marginalized. The other guards avoided the storage areas where he worked, treating them as somehow contaminated by his presence. When he did encounter colleagues in the corridors, they would look past him as if he had already ceased to exist as a member of their organization. The isolation was particularly painful during meal times in the guards' common room. Marcus had always enjoyed the camaraderie and professional discussions that took place during these gatherings, but now he found himself sitting alone while conversations died away at nearby tables. The message was clear. His colleagues had decided that association with him might somehow damage their own reputations. Young Thomas seemed particularly troubled by these developments. Marcus would occasionally catch him staring across the room with an expression of guilt and confusion. It was clear that the young man was struggling with the contradiction between what he had learned about Marcus during their training period and the current narrative being promoted by the senior guards. One evening, as Marcus was finishing his shift in the storage areas, Thomas appeared unexpectedly in the doorway. He looked around nervously, clearly concerned about being seen in conversation with the disgraced guard. When he was satisfied that they were alone, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Marcus, I wanted to thank you for everything you taught me during my training," Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I know things have been difficult lately, but I want you to know that I haven't forgotten what you did for me." Marcus was touched by the young man's gesture, though he also recognized the risk Thomas was taking by even speaking with him. In the current environment, showing sympathy for Marcus could easily make Thomas a target for similar treatment. "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied gently. "Training new guards is part of the job, and you were an excellent student. You have a bright future ahead of you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with something he wanted to say. "The way they're treating you isn't right," he finally blurted out. "Everyone knows you're one of the best guards we have. What happened to your uniform doesn't change that." The young man's words carried a risk that Marcus couldn't ignore. If Thomas continued to express such opinions, he might find himself facing the same kind of harassment and professional isolation that Marcus was experiencing. "Thomas," Marcus said seriously, "I appreciate your support, but you need to be careful. You have your own career to think about, and getting involved in this situation won't help anyone." "But it's not fair," Thomas protested, his voice rising with indignation. "They're destroying your career over something that has nothing to do with your ability to do the job." Marcus recognized the idealism and moral clarity that he had once possessed as a young guard. Time and experience had taught him that fairness was often a luxury that real life didn't afford, but he didn't want to crush Thomas's belief that right and wrong mattered. "You're correct that the situation isn't fair," Marcus acknowledged, "but sometimes we have to work within systems that are imperfect. The important thing is to maintain your own integrity and continue to serve with honor, regardless of what others choose to do." Thomas seemed to consider these words carefully, though his expression remained troubled. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked finally. Marcus was moved by the offer, but he knew that there was little anyone could do to change his circumstances. The die had been cast, and his fate within the Royal Guard was likely sealed. The best he could hope for was to serve out his remaining time with dignity and perhaps avoid outright dismissal. "The best help you can give me is to continue being the kind of guard you trained to be," Marcus replied. "Learn from everyone you can, stay alert to your duties, and remember that service is its own reward." After Thomas left, Marcus continued his work in the quiet storage areas, reflecting on the conversation and the larger situation he found himself in. The young man's visit had reminded him that not everyone had been poisoned by the campaign against him, and that somewhere beneath the surface politics and petty cruelties, there were still people who understood what the Royal Guard was supposed to represent. As the days passed, Marcus threw himself into his inventory duties with characteristic thoroughness. He developed new systems for tracking equipment, identified items that needed repair or replacement, and created detailed reports that could help improve the efficiency of supply management. It was meaningful work, even if it lacked the prestige and excitement of his former duties. His detailed attention to the inventory revealed several concerning patterns that had gone unnoticed by previous personnel. Expensive equipment was missing or unaccounted for, suggesting either theft or serious gaps in security procedures. Some weapons showed signs of poor maintenance that could compromise their effectiveness in a crisis. Most troubling of all, several ceremonial items with historical significance appeared to have been replaced with inferior copies. Marcus compiled his findings into comprehensive reports, documenting each concern with careful precision. He submitted these reports through proper channels, hoping that his discoveries might at least demonstrate his continued value to the organization. But Weeks passed without any acknowledgement or response to his work. The silence was disheartening, suggesting that his reports were being ignored or dismissed along with everything else associated with his diminished status. It seemed that once a guard fell from favor, even legitimate concerns about security and efficiency were treated as irrelevant. Meanwhile, the harassment from his colleagues continued in more subtle forms. Marcus would arrive at work to find his carefully organized storage areas deliberately disrupted, with items moved or misplaced in ways that would require hours of additional work to correct. Anonymous complaints were filed against him for minor infractions of protocol, forcing him to spend time responding to investigations rather than focusing on his assigned duties. The psychological toll of this campaign was significant, though Marcus tried not to let it show. He had always prided himself on his mental resilience and his ability to maintain focus under pressure, but the constant stress was beginning to wear him down. He found himself sleeping poorly, losing appetite, and struggling to maintain the optimistic outlook that had always sustained him through difficult times. During his off-duty hours, Marcus would walk through the city streets, observing the normal life of citizens who were protected by the security he helped provide. Families going about their daily routines, merchants conducting business, children playing in parks. All of this was possible because of the stability and peace that the Royal Guard helped maintain. These observations reminded him that his work, however thankless it might seem, contributed to something larger and more important than his personal struggles. He began to spend time in the city's public library, reading about the history of the Royal Guard and the kingdom it served. The books told stories of guards who had faced much greater challenges than his own, men and women who had sacrificed everything in defense of their principles and their duty. These historical accounts provided perspective and inspiration, reminding him that his current difficulties were part of a larger tradition of service that transcended individual hardships. One evening, while researching the history of military uniforms and insignia, Marcus came across an interesting passage about the symbolic meaning of patches and repairs in military tradition. According to the author, visible mending on a soldier's uniform had historically been viewed as a badge of honor, indicating experience in battle and dedication to duty that went beyond mere appearance. The passage described how ancient warriors would display their scars and battle-worn equipment as proof of their courage and commitment. A pristine uniform might indicate either inexperience or excessive concern with appearance at the expense of actual duty. The most respected veterans were often those whose equipment showed the honest wear of long service and genuine trials. This historical perspective offered Marcus a new way of thinking about his own situation. Perhaps the patch on his sleeve, rather than being a source of shame, could be seen as a mark of honor, evidence of his willingness to engage in the dangerous work of protecting others, even at personal cost. Elena's careful stitching represented not poverty, but love and dedication that had sustained him through one of the most challenging periods of his life. As he walked home that evening, Marcus felt a subtle shift in his internal perspective. The mockery and professional isolation remained painful, but they no longer felt like definitive judgments on his worth or character. Instead, they seemed like temporary obstacles to be endured while he continued to pursue his true purpose of service and protection. The next morning brought news that would soon test everyone in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Foreign military advisors would be conducting an inspection of the palace security arrangements, and every member of the Royal Guard would be subject to their evaluation. The announcement sent ripples of anxiety through the Guard force, as everyone scrambled to ensure that their performance and appearance would meet the scrutiny of experienced military professionals. For Marcus, working in the storage areas removed from active duty, the inspection initially seemed irrelevant to his daily routine. But he would soon discover that sometimes the most significant moments arrive from the most unexpected directions, and that true character reveals itself not in times of comfort and recognition, but in moments when everything seems lost and hopeless. The announcement of the foreign military inspection created an atmosphere of intense preparation throughout the palace. Guards who had previously spent their time gossiping and harassing Marcus suddenly found themselves consumed with ensuring their own uniforms were immaculate and their knowledge of protocols was complete. Captain Reynolds issued a stream of directives about appearance standards, conduct during the inspection, and the importance of projecting strength and competence to the visiting officers. Marcus watched this transformation with a mixture of irony and professional interest. The same guards who had mocked his appearance were now obsessing over every detail of their own uniforms, seeking advice from tailors and spending significant amounts of money on polish, thread, and minor adjustments. The sudden concern for standards revealed how shallow their previous criticism had been. It was never really about maintaining excellence, but about finding a convenient target for their insecurities and prejudices. From his position in the storage areas, Marcus could observe the preparation activities without being directly involved. He continued his inventory work with characteristic thoroughness, though he couldn't help but notice that several guards were now visiting the storage areas to request equipment and supplies they had previously ignored. Items that had been gathering dust for months suddenly became essential for presenting the proper image to the inspectors. Lieutenant Harrison appeared one afternoon, looking uncharacteristically nervous as he searched through ceremonial equipment. His usual arrogance had been replaced by obvious anxiety about the upcoming evaluation, and he seemed almost surprised to find Marcus working efficiently in the storage areas. "Marcus," Harrison said hesitantly, "I'm looking for the ceremonial sword belts for the honor guard formation. The regular quartermaster said you might know where they're stored." It was the first time in weeks that any of the guards had spoken to Marcus with anything approaching respect, and the change in tone was telling. Harrison needed information that only Marcus's experience could provide, and desperation had temporarily overcome his previous disdain. "They're in the secured cabinet near the back wall," Marcus replied professionally, pointing toward the appropriate location. "The keys are with Sergeant Walsh, but I can show you which ones you need if you'd like." Harrison's relief was obvious as Marcus led him to the correct storage area and helped him identify the proper equipment. As they worked together to gather the ceremonial items, Harrison seemed to struggle with whether to acknowledge the irony of the situation. He was now depending on the same guard he had been instrumental in marginalizing. "Marcus," Harrison said finally, his voice awkward with reluctant gratitude, "thank you for the help. I know things have been difficult lately." It was the closest thing to an apology that Marcus was likely to receive, though he recognized it for what it was, an expression of temporary need rather than genuine remorse. Harrison was concerned about his own performance during the inspection, not about the injustices he had helped perpetrate. "Just doing my job," Marcus replied simply, choosing not to make the lieutenant's discomfort worse than necessary. There was no point in extracting acknowledgments or apologies from someone who was only being civil out of immediate necessity. Over the next few days, similar interactions occurred with increasing frequency. Guards who had avoided the storage areas suddenly found reasons to visit, seeking equipment, information, or assistance with protocol questions that Marcus's experience had prepared him to answer. Each interaction was polite, but strained, as his colleagues tried to balance their need for his knowledge against their desire to maintain social distance. Young Thomas proved to be an exception to this pattern. Unlike the others, his visits seemed motivated by genuine concern rather than immediate need. He would stop by during quiet periods to check on Marcus's well-being and to share news about the preparation activities happening throughout the palace. "The foreign officers arrived yesterday," Thomas reported during one of these visits. "There are 5 of them, all with impressive credentials and experience in palace security. Captain Reynolds is beside himself trying to make sure everything goes perfectly." Marcus appreciated these updates, as his isolation from active duty meant he was often unaware of significant developments. Thomas's willingness to share information demonstrated both personal loyalty and professional respect that transcended the current social dynamics. "What's your impression of the visiting officers?" Marcus asked, genuinely interested in the young guard's observations. Thomas considered the question carefully before responding. "They seem very professional and thorough. Not the kind of people who would be impressed by surface appearances alone. I get the sense that they're more interested in substance than style." This assessment aligned with Marcus's own understanding of serious military professionals. In his experience, officers with real combat and security experience tended to focus on competence and effectiveness rather than superficial details. They could distinguish between genuine capability and empty pageantry, having learned through experience what truly mattered in critical situations. The day of the inspection arrived with unseasonably cold weather that seemed to match the nervous tension throughout the palace. Marcus began his shift in the storage areas as usual, assuming that the inspection activities would take place in the more visible areas of the palace complex. He had reconciled himself to being a forgotten footnote to the day's events, someone whose exile to inventory duties had removed him from any meaningful participation. However, the visiting officers proved to be more thorough than anyone had anticipated. Rather than limiting themselves to formal presentations and ceremonial displays, they insisted on examining all aspects of palace security, including supply management, equipment maintenance, and support operations. Their approach reflected a comprehensive understanding that effective security required attention to details that were often overlooked by those focused on appearances. Sergeant Walsh appeared in the storage area around midday, accompanied by one of the foreign officers, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that commanded immediate respect. Marcus recognized her as the same person who had studied his uniform patch during her previous visit to the palace gates. Now, seeing her up close, he could observe the intelligence and experience that marked her as someone who had earned her position through merit rather than politics. "This is Marcus," Walsh explained to the officer, "one of our most experienced guards. He's been handling our inventory and supply management review." The officer, who introduced herself as Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Allied Forces Strategic Security Division, studied Marcus with the same intense attention she had shown during their previous encounter. Her gaze took in his worn uniform and the distinctive patch, but her expression was analytical rather than judgmental. "Marcus," she said in a voice that carried authority without being harsh, "Sergeant Walsh tells me you've identified some significant issues with equipment management and supply chain security. I'd like to hear about your findings." This was an unexpected development that Marcus hadn't prepared for. He had assumed his reports had been ignored or dismissed, but apparently Sergeant Walsh had forwarded them through appropriate channels. Now he found himself being asked to brief a senior foreign military officer on problems he had discovered during his inventory work. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, quickly organizing his thoughts and moving to the filing system where he kept his detailed reports. "I've documented several areas of concern that could potentially impact security operations." Over the next hour, Marcus walked Colonel Mitchell through his findings with the same thoroughness and professionalism that had characterized his entire career. He showed her examples of missing equipment, identified maintenance issues that could compromise operational effectiveness, and explained patterns in the inventory discrepancies that suggested systematic problems rather than random oversight. Colonel Mitchell asked probing questions that demonstrated both technical expertise and strategic understanding. She clearly grasped the security implications of the issues Marcus had identified, and she took detailed notes as he explained his analysis and recommendations. Her attention to his briefing was complete and respectful, treating him as a knowledgeable professional rather than a disgraced guard relegated to menial duties. "This is excellent work," Colonel Mitchell said when Marcus had finished his presentation. "Your analysis shows exactly the kind of attention to detail that effective security requires. These aren't minor administrative issues. Some of these problems could create serious vulnerabilities in a crisis situation." The praise was unexpected and deeply meaningful to Marcus, coming as it did from someone whose opinion carried genuine weight. It had been months since anyone had acknowledged his competence or valued his professional contributions, and Colonel Mitchell's recognition reminded him that his skills and experience retained their worth regardless of his current circumstances. "How long have you been working in supply management?" Colonel Mitchell asked, though her tone suggested she suspected there was more to Marcus's background than his current assignment would indicate. "This is a recent assignment," Marcus replied carefully. "I've spent most of my 30 years of service in active security duties." Colonel Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. 30 years of active service, and you're currently assigned to inventory management? Her question carried implications that Marcus wasn't sure how to address without seeming to criticize his superiors. "Personnel assignments are made based on organizational needs," Marcus said diplomatically, though he suspected Colonel Mitchell was experienced enough to read between the lines. "Of course," she replied, but her expression suggested she understood more about the situation than she was letting on. "Would it be possible for me to review your service record? I'm interested in understanding the full scope of experience represented in the Palace Security Force." This request surprised Marcus, as he couldn't imagine why a foreign officer would want to examine his personnel files. Service records typically contain routine information about assignments, training, and performance evaluations, nothing that would seem relevant to a security inspection. That would be a matter for Captain Reynolds or the administrative office, Marcus replied. I don't have access to my own files from here. Colonel Michel nodded thoughtfully. I'll make that request through appropriate channels. Thank you for the briefing, Marcus. Your work here has been very informative. As the colonel and Sergeant Walsh left the storage area, Marcus reflected on the unusual interaction. There had been something in Colonel Mitchell's manner that suggested her interest went beyond standard inspection procedures. Her questions about his background and her request to review his service record implied a level of curiosity that seemed disproportionate to a routine security assessment. The remainder of the day passed quietly, with Marcus returning to his regular inventory tasks while wondering about the potential consequences of his briefing with Colonel Mitchell. In his experience, unusual attention from senior officers could lead to either positive or negative outcomes, and, given his current circumstances, he was inclined to expect the latter. That evening, as Marcus was preparing to end his shift, Thomas appeared with news that the inspection was generating considerable discussion among the guard leadership. Apparently, the foreign officers had identified several areas where palace security could be improved, and their recommendations were causing significant consternation among the senior staff. Captain Reynolds is furious, Thomas reported, keeping his voice low despite their privacy. The inspectors found problems with communication procedures, response protocols, and equipment maintenance. Some of the issues they identified were apparently the same ones you documented in your reports. This information confirmed Marcus's suspicion that his inventory work had uncovered genuine security concerns. It was gratifying to know that his analysis had been validated by independent experts, though he suspected this validation would not necessarily improve his standing with his superiors. What kind of recommendations did they make? Marcus asked, curious about the inspector's assessment. Thomas consulted notes he had written during conversations with other guards. They want to see improved training procedures, better coordination between different security units, and more thorough equipment monitoring. They also recommended that the palace make better use of experienced personnel for training and advisory roles. The last recommendation caught Marcus's attention, as it seemed to align with Colonel Mitchell's questions about his background and experience. Perhaps the foreign officers had recognized that the palace was not making optimal use of its human resources, though he doubted this insight would translate into any improvement in his own situation. As Thomas prepared to leave, he hesitated at the doorway, as if struggling with something he wanted to say. Finally, he turned back with an expression of determination that Marcus hadn't seen before. Marcus, I need to tell you something, Thomas said seriously. I've been keeping quiet about what's been happening to you, but I don't think I can do that anymore. The way you've been treated isn't just unfair, it's wrong, and it's making the entire guard force weaker. Marcus appreciated the young man's moral courage, but he was also concerned about the risks Thomas might be taking. Speaking out against the treatment of a disgraced guard could easily make Thomas himself a target for retaliation. I understand your feelings, Marcus replied, but you need to be careful about how you express them. Your career is just beginning, and you don't want to damage your future prospects over something you can't change. Thomas shook his head firmly. Some things are more important than career prospects. If we don't stand up for what's right, then we're not really serving with honor, are we? The young guard's words echoed principles that Marcus had tried to live by throughout his own career, though experience had taught him that standing up for principles often came with significant personal costs. Still, he was moved by Thomas's integrity and his willingness to risk his own standing for the sake of justice. Whatever you decide to do, Marcus said carefully, make sure you think it through completely. Consider all the potential consequences, not just for yourself, but for others who might be affected. Thomas nodded, though his expression remained determined. I will, but I also need to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I didn't just stand by when something wrong was happening. After Thomas left, Marcus found himself thinking about the complex dynamics that govern palace life and military organizations in general. The young guard's moral clarity was admirable, but it also represented a kind of idealism that experience often complicated. Marcus had learned that fighting injustice sometimes required strategic thinking and careful timing rather than direct confrontation. As he walked home through the darkening streets, Marcus reflected on the day's unexpected developments. Colonel Mitchell's interest in his work and background suggested that someone in authority had finally recognized his competence and value. Whether this recognition would translate into any meaningful change in his circumstances remained to be seen, but It offered a glimmer of hope in what had been a very dark period. The evening air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sounds of city life continuing its normal rhythms. Marcus found comfort in these familiar sensations, reminders that life continued beyond the narrow world of palace politics and professional rivalries. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he would face them with the same integrity and dedication that had sustained him throughout his career. In the small room above the bakery, Marcus carefully cleaned and pressed his uniform for another day of service. The distinctive patch on his sleeve caught the lamplight, and he thought about Elena's words about repairs that didn't try to hide themselves. Perhaps his current circumstances were similar, visible evidence of damage that had been survived and overcome rather than concealed or denied. As he prepared for sleep, Marcus allowed himself to hope that Colonel Mitchell's attention might lead to some recognition of his true value and capabilities. But even if nothing changed, he knew that he would continue to serve with honor and dedication, drawing strength from the memory of Elena's love and the knowledge that true worth could not be diminished by the opinions or actions of others. The inspection had revealed that substance mattered more than appearance to those who truly understood security and military excellence. Tomorrow would show whether this revelation would have any impact on his own situation, or whether the entrenched attitudes and prejudices of his colleagues would continue to define his place in the organization he had served so faithfully for so many years. The morning after the inspection brought an unusual summons that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his situation. Instead of reporting to the storage areas for his regular inventory duties, he was instructed to present himself at the main administrative office at 8 o'clock sharp. The message, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk, provided no explanation for the change in routine, leaving Marcus to wonder whether he was about to face formal disciplinary action or something else entirely. As he made his way through the palace corridors, Marcus encountered several colleagues who seemed to regard him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Word had apparently spread that something significant was happening, though no one seemed to know exactly what. Captain Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual given his tendency to involve himself in any situation that might affect his authority or reputation. The administrative office buzzed with activity when Marcus arrived, with clerks hurrying between desks and senior officials engaged in intense conversations. The atmosphere suggested that important decisions were being made, though the specific nature of those decisions remained unclear. Marcus reported to the reception desk and was immediately escorted to a conference room where several people were already assembled. Colonel Mitchell sat at the head of a polished oak table, flanked by two other foreign officers whom Marcus recognized from the previous day's inspection activities. Across from them sat palace officials, including the deputy administrator, the chief of security, and Sergeant Walsh. The formal arrangement of the meeting suggested that this was not a routine administrative matter, but rather something that required high-level attention and decision-making authority. "Please have a seat, Marcus," Colonel Mitchell said, gesturing toward an empty chair at the table. Her tone was professional, but not unfriendly, though Marcus couldn't help but feel nervous about being the apparent focus of such a gathering. The deputy administrator, a stern-faced man named Sir Edmund Hartley, consulted a thick folder of documents before addressing Marcus directly. "We've been reviewing your service record in detail," he said, "and Colonel Mitchell has made some observations about your current assignment that require discussion." Marcus maintained his composure while inwardly bracing himself for what might come next. In his experience, formal meetings like this rarely led to positive outcomes for guards in his situation. He suspected he was about to be informed of further demotions, additional restrictions, or possibly even termination of his employment. "Your record shows 30 years of exemplary service," Sir Edmund continued, reading from the documents before him. "Multiple commendations, several instances of exceptional performance during security incidents, and consistently high evaluation scores from supervisors. This creates something of a puzzle regarding your current assignment to inventory management." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, her expression serious but not hostile. "Marcus, yesterday you briefed me on significant security vulnerabilities that you discovered through your inventory work. Your analysis demonstrated exactly the kind of professional competence and attention to detail that effective security requires. This raises questions about why someone with your experience and capabilities is working in a support role rather than active security duties." The direction of the conversation was not what Marcus had expected, and he found himself uncertain about how to respond. He had assumed that his marginalization was common knowledge, and that any investigation would focus on the superficial issues that had been used to justify his treatment. Instead, these senior officials seemed to be questioning the logic of his current situation. "I serve wherever I'm assigned," Marcus replied carefully, not wanting to appear insubordinate while also avoiding any criticism of his superiors. "Personnel decisions are made by those with appropriate authority." Sir Edmund exchanged a meaningful look with Colonel Mitchell before continuing. "That's true, but personnel decisions should be based on operational needs and individual capabilities rather than other considerations. We're trying to understand the reasoning behind your current assignment." Colonel Mitchell consulted her own notes before speaking. "Marcus, I need to ask you directly about the circumstances that led to your transfer from active security duties. Please be completely honest. This conversation is being conducted under the authority of the Security Review, and accuracy is more important than diplomacy." The request put Marcus in a difficult position. Telling the complete truth would require him to describe the harassment and discrimination he had experienced, which could be seen as complaining about his superiors or making excuses for his situation. But lying or omitting important details might undermine whatever investigation was taking place. "The stated reason for my transfer was concerns about my uniform and appearance," Marcus said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "There were complaints from visiting officials about my professional presentation, and it was determined that interior duties would be more appropriate." "And what were the specific concerns about your appearance?" Colonel Mitchell asked, though her tone suggested she might already know the answer. Marcus hesitated before responding, acutely aware that his worn uniform and distinctive patch were visible to everyone in the room. "My uniform shows signs of age and has been repaired multiple times. Some viewed this as unprofessional and not befitting the standards of the Royal Guard." Colonel Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed your uniform during my previous visits to the palace. The patch on your sleeve is particularly distinctive. Can you tell me how you acquired that damage?" The question surprised Marcus, as he hadn't expected anyone to inquire about the specific circumstances behind his uniform's condition. The memory of that day, when he had been wounded while protecting the royal family, remained vivid and meaningful to him, though he had never spoken about it publicly. "It happened during a security incident approximately 8 months ago," Marcus explained. "An intruder had breached the outer perimeter and was attempting to reach the royal quarters. During the struggle to subdue him, I sustained a knife wound to my arm. The patch covers the tear in my sleeve from that encounter." The room fell silent as the implications of this information became clear to everyone present. Colonel Mitchell made a note in her file, while Sir Edmund's expression shifted from neutral inquiry to obvious surprise. The other officials exchanged glances that suggested this was the first time they had heard these details. "Was this incident properly documented?" Sir Edmund asked, his tone now carrying a note of concern. "Are there official records of your injury and the circumstances surrounding it?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "The incident report was filed through standard procedures, and I received medical treatment for the wound. The intruder was apprehended and turned over to the appropriate authorities." Colonel Mitchell leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "So the patch that has been cited as evidence of unprofessional appearance actually covers a wound received in the line of duty while protecting the royal family?" "That's correct, ma'am," Marcus confirmed, though he was still uncertain about the direction of the conversation or its potential outcomes. Sir Edmund consulted the documents in his folder with obvious confusion. "This information doesn't appear in the materials I was provided regarding your transfer. The only documentation I have relates to appearance standards and visitor complaints." The revelation that relevant information had been omitted from the official records created an uncomfortable atmosphere in the room. It suggested that either important details had been overlooked or that someone had deliberately failed to include information that might have painted Marcus's situation in a different light. Colonel Mitchell exchanged another significant look with her colleagues before addressing the room. "This conversation has revealed information that needs to be investigated further. I think we need to speak with Captain Reynolds and get his perspective on these personnel decisions." The mention of Reynolds' name caused visible tension among the palace officials, though no one immediately voiced objections to involving him in the discussion. Sir Edmund made a note and indicated that arrangements would be made to continue the meeting with additional participants. Marcus, Colonel Mitchell said, "I want you to understand that this review is about ensuring optimal use of personnel resources for security purposes. The foreign officer's assessment has identified several areas where the palace could improve its effectiveness, and proper utilization of experienced guards is one of those areas." Over the next hour, the meeting expanded to include additional participants as various officials were called in to provide information about personnel policies, assignment procedures, and the specific circumstances surrounding Marcus's transfer. Each new revelation seemed to raise additional questions about the decision-making process and the factors that had influenced his current situation. Captain Reynolds finally arrived, clearly uncomfortable about being summoned to explain his actions to a room full of senior officials. His usual confidence had been replaced by obvious nervousness as he took a seat across from the foreign officers and began fielding questions about Marcus's performance and assignment history. "Captain Reynolds," Colonel Mitchell began, "we're reviewing personnel assignments as part of our security assessment. Can you explain the reasoning behind Marcus's transfer from active security duties to inventory management?" Reynolds glanced nervously around the room before responding. "The transfer was based on concerns about maintaining appropriate standards for the Royal Guard. We received complaints about appearance issues that needed to be addressed." "What specific performance issues led to this decision?" Sir Edmund asked, consulting the documentation he had been provided. "The service record shows consistently high evaluations and no disciplinary actions. The concerns were about professional appearance and the image projected to palace visitors," Reynolds replied, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Standards have to be maintained across all personnel." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward with an expression of focused attention. "Captain, are you aware that the appearance issues you're referring to include a uniform patch that covers a wound received while protecting the royal family?" The question clearly caught Reynolds off guard, and his expression shifted to one of uncomfortable surprise. He glanced at Marcus with what might have been recognition, as if he was seeing the situation from a new perspective for the first time. "I was aware of the incident," Reynolds said slowly, "but the appearance concerns were raised independently of that context." "So you transferred one of your most experienced guards to a support role because visitors commented on a patch that covered a wound received in the line of duty?" Colonel Mitchell's tone was carefully neutral, but the implications of her question were unmistakable. The room fell silent as Reynolds struggled to provide a response that would justify his actions. It was becoming clear that the appearance-based rationale for Marcus's transfer looked very different when placed in proper context, and that the decision-making process had failed to consider important information about the circumstances involved. Sir Edmund set down his documents and looked directly at Reynolds. "Captain, it appears that significant context was omitted from the documentation provided to this office. Can you explain why the circumstances of Marcus's injury were not included in the transfer justification?" Reynolds' discomfort was increasingly obvious as he realized that his actions were being scrutinized by people who understood the full implications of what had happened. The narrative of maintaining standards that had seemed so compelling when applied to an apparently indigent guard looked very different when applied to someone who had been wounded while protecting the royal family. "The appearance issues were the primary concern," Reynolds repeated, but his words lacked conviction. "Personnel decisions have to consider multiple factors." Colonel Mitchell consulted her notes before asking another pointed question. "Captain, in your professional opinion, does a guard's willingness to sustain injury while protecting the royal family demonstrate the kind of dedication and commitment that the service values?" It was a question that could not be answered without acknowledging the fundamental contradiction in Reynolds' position. Either Marcus's wound was evidence of exceptional service that should be honored, or it was irrelevant to his professional standing. There was no middle ground that would allow Reynolds to maintain both his previous position and his credibility. "Of course, such dedication is valued," Reynolds admitted reluctantly, "but appearance standards also matter for the organization's reputation." "I see," Colonel Mitchell replied thoughtfully. "So your position is that a guard who sustains injury while protecting the royal family should be transferred to lesser duties if his wound results in uniform damage that affects his appearance." The star presentation of Reynolds' logic revealed its fundamental flaws and moral implications. Around the room, other officials were taking notes and exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Marcus watched this development with amazement, never having imagined that his situation would receive this level of scrutiny or that his side of the story would be heard by people with the authority to make meaningful changes. The meeting continued for another hour as various aspects of personnel policy and decision-making procedures were examined. It became increasingly clear that Marcus's transfer had been based on superficial considerations that ignored important context, and that the process had failed to meet the standards of fairness and thoroughness that should govern such decisions. When the formal session finally concluded, Colonel Mitchell asked Marcus to remain behind for a private conversation. After the other participants had left, she studied him with the same intense attention he had noticed during their previous encounters. "Marcus," she said finally, "I want you to understand that this review process is about more than just your individual situation. We're examining how the palace utilizes its human resources and whether personnel decisions support or undermine security effectiveness." The conversation that followed would prove to be even more revealing than the formal meeting, as Colonel Mitchell explained observations that would soon transform not only Marcus's circumstances, but his entire understanding of who he was and what his service had meant to others beyond the narrow world of palace politics. After the room had cleared, Colonel Mitchell's demeanor shifted from formal investigator to something more personal and direct. She studied Marcus with an intensity that suggested this conversation would be different from the official proceedings they had just concluded. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of emotion that had been carefully controlled during the formal meeting. "Marcus," she began slowly, "there's something I need to tell you about why I've taken such a specific interest in your case. It's not just about security protocols or personnel management. It's much more personal than that." Marcus waited, uncertain what this revelation might entail, but sensing that it would be significant. Colonel Mitchell's behavior throughout the inspection process had suggested knowledge or interest that went beyond routine professional duties, and he suspected he was about to learn the reason for her particular attention to his circumstances. 23 years ago, Colonel Mitchell continued, "I was a young lieutenant serving in a joint military operation in a conflict zone far from here. My unit was ambushed during what should have been a routine patrol, and we found ourselves pinned down by enemy forces with no apparent way to escape." She paused, her eyes distant as she revisited what was clearly a painful memory. "We had taken casualties, our communications equipment was damaged, and our position was becoming increasingly untenable. It looked like we weren't going to make it out alive." Marcus listened intently, understanding that this story was building towards something that would explain Colonel Mitchell's involvement in his situation. Military personnel often formed bonds through shared experiences, and he suspected that his own circumstances had somehow connected with this memory from her past. "What saved us," Colonel Mitchell continued, "was the intervention of a member of the Royal Guard who was serving as an advisor to Allied forces. This guard had been attached to our operation as a liaison, and when the situation deteriorated, he took extraordinary risks to coordinate our rescue." The colonel reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be official documents and photographs. The guard in question sustained significant injuries during the rescue operation, including wounds from shrapnel and knife attacks from enemy soldiers. His actions directly saved the lives of 7 Allied personnel, including myself. She opened the folder and showed Marcus a photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. It was an image of himself, 23 years younger and wearing a field uniform, standing with a group of military personnel in what was clearly a combat zone. His face was younger and unmarked by the years of grief and hardship that would follow, but it was unmistakably him. "You probably don't remember me specifically," Colonel Mitchell said gently, "but you saved my life and the lives of my entire unit. The citation for your service in that operation is in my permanent files, along with detailed accounts of your courage and tactical expertise." Marcus stared at the photograph, memories flooding back of an assignment that had seemed routine at the time, but had escalated into one of the most dangerous situations of his career. He remembered the ambush, the desperate fighting, and the complex coordination required to extract the Allied personnel from their precarious position. But the faces of individual soldiers had blurred together over the intervening years, and he had never known the long-term impact of his actions on their lives and careers. "I've followed your career intermittently over the years," Colonel Mitchell continued, checking on your assignments and achievements through official channels. "When I saw your name on the Palace Guard roster for this inspection, I was looking forward to reconnecting with someone who had played such an important role in my life." She gestured toward his worn uniform and the distinctive patch that had caused him so much grief. When I saw your current circumstances and the way you were being treated, I was frankly appalled. The man who had shown such courage and competence in combat was being marginalized and humiliated over superficial concerns about his appearance. The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened during the inspection process. Colonel Mitchell's questions about his background, her request to review his service records, and her pointed inquiries about his current assignment suddenly made perfect sense. She had been conducting her own investigation into how the palace was treating a guard whose capabilities and character she knew firsthand. "Colonel," Marcus said, struggling to process this information, "I had no idea you were among the personnel in that operation. I remember the mission, but individual faces and names from so long ago." "Of course you wouldn't remember," she replied with a slight smile. "You were focused on the tactical situation, and there were many people involved. But for those of us whose lives you saved, the memory is much more vivid and personal." Colonel Mitchell showed him additional documents from a folder, including his own after-action report from a mission and commendations from Allied military leaders. Reading his own words from decades earlier, Marcus was struck by how clinical and matter-of-fact his account had been, focusing on procedures and outcomes rather than the personal risks and dramatic nature of the situation. "What struck me then, and what I see again now," Colonel Mitchell observed, "is your tendency to downplay your own contributions and focus on doing whatever is necessary to accomplish the mission. You wrote that report as if coordinating the rescue of 7 Allied personnel under enemy fire was just another day at the office." She leaned forward, her expression serious and intent. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. That mission launched my career in military intelligence and special operations. The experience of working under extreme pressure, seeing how tactical problems could be solved through creative thinking and personal courage, that shaped my entire approach to military service." The colonel closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. "I've spent the last 23 years trying to embody the kind of professionalism and dedication that you demonstrated in that operation. When I learned that the guard who had saved my life was being treated as a liability because of the appearance of his uniform, I knew I had to do something about it." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications of this revelation. For months, he had struggled with feelings of worthlessness and rejection, believing that his years of service had been forgotten or deemed irrelevant. Now he was learning that his actions had had profound effects on other people's lives and that his reputation among serious military professionals remained strong despite his current circumstances. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, uncertain how this personal connection might affect the official investigation into his treatment. Colonel Mitchell's expression became businesslike again, though her tone remained warm. "Now we implement the recommendations that my team is making to the palace administration. And those recommendations include some very specific changes regarding personnel utilization and assignment policies." She explained that her team's assessment had identified numerous areas where the palace security force could improve its effectiveness through better use of experienced personnel. Their report would recommend that guards with specialized knowledge and proven capabilities be assigned to roles that maximize their contributions to overall security. "In your specific case," Colonel Mitchell said, "we're recommending that you be appointed to a new position, Senior Security Advisor, responsible for training new guards, conducting security assessments, and serving as a liaison with foreign military visitors. It's a role that would utilize your experience and expertise while providing the kind of professional respect that your service record deserves." The proposed position represented not just a restoration of Marcus's status, but an elevation to a level of responsibility and recognition that exceeded anything he had experienced in his previous assignments. It would place him in a role where his knowledge and experience could benefit the entire organization while providing him with the professional respect he had earned through decades of dedicated service. "The palace administration will be implementing these recommendations immediately," Colonel Mitchell continued. "The Foreign Ministry has indicated that continued security cooperation depends on the palace demonstrating that it can effectively utilize its personnel resources and maintain professional standards that focus on substance rather than superficial concerns." Marcus felt a mixture of gratitude, relief, and overwhelming emotion as he absorbed this information. After months of marginalization and humiliation, the the prospect of not only being restored to active duty, but being elevated to a position of genuine authority and respect seemed almost too good to believe. "There's one more thing," Colonel Mitchell added, reaching into her briefcase again. "I've taken the liberty of arranging for you to receive a new uniform appropriate to your new position. But I want you to understand that this isn't because there was anything wrong with the one you've been wearing." She handed him an official document bearing multiple military seals and signatures. "This is a formal commendation recognizing your service in a joint operation 23 years ago. It should have been processed through your personnel files at the time, but apparently there was some administrative oversight. Better late than never." Reading the commendation, Marcus saw his actions described in terms that he barely recognized. The clinical language of military citations transformed his memory of a difficult day into an account of exceptional courage and tactical brilliance that had preserved Allied lives and contributed to operational success. Most significantly, the document bore the signatures of senior officers from multiple Allied nations, indicating that his actions had been recognized at the highest levels of military command. The citation mentions your willingness to sustain personal injury in order to protect Allied personnel, Colonel Mitchell noted, pointing to a specific passage. "I thought you might appreciate the parallel to your recent injury while protecting the royal family. It seems that placing yourself at risk for the sake of others is a consistent pattern in your service record." The formal commendation would become part of Marcus's official personnel file, providing documented evidence of the kind of service that had previously been known only through informal channels and personal memories. It would serve as a counterweight to the superficial criticisms that had been used to justify his recent treatment. Over the next few days, the changes resulting from the foreign officer's recommendations were implemented with remarkable speed. Captain Reynolds found himself reassigned to administrative duties, while Lieutenant Harrison was enrolled in additional training programs designed to improve his understanding of personnel management and professional development. The message was clear. The palace would no longer tolerate leadership that prioritized appearance over competence. Marcus's transition to his new role as senior security advisor began immediately, though the psychological adjustment took longer than the administrative changes. After months of isolation and marginalization, he found it difficult to believe that his opinions were not only welcome, but actively sought by colleagues who had previously avoided him. Young Thomas was among the first to congratulate Marcus on his new position, and their conversation revealed how the events had affected other members of the Guard force. Many of the junior guards had been uncomfortable with the treatment Marcus had received, but had lacked the authority or courage to speak out against it. They viewed his rehabilitation as validation of their own sense that something fundamentally wrong had been taking place. "I'm glad you didn't give up," Thomas said during one of their conversations. "There were times when I was afraid you might just resign rather than continue dealing with all the harassment." Marcus reflected on how close he had come to that decision during some of the darkest moments of the preceding months. Elena's memory and his own sense of duty had sustained him, but there had been days when continuing seemed almost impossible. Now, looking back from his new position of respect and authority, he could see that persistence had ultimately been vindicated. The transformation in how his colleagues treated him was dramatic and immediate. Guards who had avoided him for months now sought his advice on security procedures and protocol questions. His expertise, which had been dismissed and ignored when he was considered a pariah, was suddenly valued and respected again. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in his own sense of purpose and self-worth. The revelation that his service had had lasting impact on other people's lives and careers provided a perspective that transcended the petty politics and superficial concerns that had dominated his recent experience. He began to understand that true service often went unrecognized in the moment, but could have profound effects that were only revealed years later. Colonel Mitchell's team completed their assessment and departed, but not before she had a final conversation with Marcus about the broader implications of what had transpired. She emphasized that his case had highlighted systemic issues within palace administration that needed to be addressed to ensure that similar injustices didn't occur in the future. "What happened to you was wrong on multiple levels," she said, "but it also revealed strengths in your character that many people never have the opportunity to demonstrate. You maintained your integrity and dedication under extremely difficult circumstances, and that says something important about who you are as a person and as a professional." In his new role, Marcus found himself working directly with senior palace officials to develop improved training programs and security protocols. His decades of experience provided insights that proved invaluable for addressing the vulnerabilities and inefficiencies that the foreign assessment had identified. The work was challenging and meaningful, utilizing his knowledge in ways that benefited the entire organization. The distinctive patch on his sleeve, which had been the source of so much mockery and criticism, now served as a conversation starter when he met with visiting officials and foreign military personnel. His willingness to explain the circumstances behind the patch and the injury it covered became part of his professional narrative, demonstrating the kind of commitment and sacrifice that military professionals understood and respected. Elena's careful stitching, which had once seemed like a mark of poverty and shame, was now revealed as a symbol of love and resilience that had carried him through his darkest period. The patch remained visible on his new uniform, not because he couldn't afford to replace it, but because it had become part of his identity and his story. Months later, as Marcus stood at his new post training a group of junior guards, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The young recruits listened attentively as he shared lessons learned from decades of service, including the importance of maintaining integrity and dedication even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Thomas, now promoted to corporal, served as Marcus's assistant in the training programs, and their partnership demonstrated how professional relationships could transcend hierarchical boundaries when based on mutual respect and shared values. The young guard's moral courage during Marcus's difficult period had not been forgotten, and his willingness to stand up for what was right had been recognized and rewarded. The storage areas where Marcus had worked during his exile had been reorganized according to his recommendations, and the inventory systems he had developed were now used throughout the palace complex. His detailed reports on security vulnerabilities had led to significant improvements in equipment management and maintenance procedures, contributing to overall organizational effectiveness. Captain Reynolds, in his new administrative role, had grudgingly acknowledged that Marcus's contributions to palace security had been substantial and that his previous treatment had been based on flawed judgment. While their relationship remained somewhat strained, the formal recognition of Marcus's value had eliminated the open hostility and professional sabotage that had characterized their previous interactions. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus established new routines that reflected his elevated status and expanded responsibilities. His small room above the bakery remained his home, though he could now afford better accommodations if he chose. The simplicity of his living situation had become a conscious choice rather than a financial necessity, and it served as a reminder of the journey he had traveled and the lessons he had learned. In the evenings, he would sit at his small table reading professional journals and planning training exercises, the framed photograph of Elena nearby, to remind him of the love and support that had sustained him through his trials. Her presence remained vivid in his memory, and he could imagine her satisfaction at seeing him restored to a position where his talents and dedication were properly valued and utilized. The story of his transformation had spread throughout the palace and beyond, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of superficial judgments and the importance of recognizing true merit regardless of appearances. Military personnel from other kingdoms would sometimes visit specifically to meet the guard whose case had exposed fundamental flaws in personnel management and whose resilience had ultimately led to positive changes. But for Marcus, the most important outcome was not the recognition or the improved circumstances, but the knowledge that his service continued to have meaning and purpose. The young guards he trained would carry forward the lessons he taught them, and the security improvements he helped implement would protect future generations of royal family members and palace staff. Standing watch at the palace gates in his new role, Marcus often thought about the circular nature of his journey. He had begun as a young recruit full of idealism and dedication, had faced trials that tested both his competence and his character, and had emerged as a senior advisor whose experience could guide others facing similar challenges. The patch on his sleeve caught the morning sunlight as he reviewed security protocols with a group of visiting officials. No longer a source of shame or mockery, it had become a symbol of service, sacrifice, and, ultimately, redemption. The threads that Elena had sewn with such care had held firm through all the storms he had weathered, just as her love continued to strengthen him years after her death. Colonel Mitchell's final report on palace security had commended the organization for its willingness to implement meaningful reforms and for its recognition that true security depended on utilizing the best capabilities of all personnel regardless of their economic circumstances or superficial appearance. The report had become a model for other institutions seeking to improve their own personnel management practices. As the day progressed and new challenges emerged, Marcus faced them with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that adversity could ultimately strengthen rather than weaken those who maintained their integrity and perseverance. The ridicule and marginalization he had endured had revealed both the worst and best aspects of human nature, and had ultimately led to positive changes that benefited many people beyond himself. The Royal Guard continued its mission of protecting the palace and serving the crown, now with improved procedures and more effective utilization of personnel. The lessons learned from Marcus's case have been integrated into training programs and policy guidelines, helping to ensure that future instances of unfair treatment would be less likely to occur. In the end, the worn tunic and distinctive patch that had been sources of mockery and shame had become symbols of deeper truths about service, sacrifice, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the substance of a person's character and contributions. The general's recognition had not only restored Marcus to his rightful place, but had transformed the entire organization's understanding of what truly mattered in military service. The story would be told and retold in military circles for years to come, serving as a reminder that true honor could not be diminished by temporary circumstances, and that sometimes the most valuable people were those whose worth was not immediately apparent to superficial observation. Marcus's journey from ridicule to recognition had proven that integrity and dedication would ultimately be vindicated, even when the path seemed darkest and most hopeless.